Welcome to this Blitz question and answer session. First question. Can you break down what happened with the propagandist who got fired for talking about drowning innocent children? Yes. I think this is actually interesting, which is why I wanted to start with that question. The key story here is that propaganda is autonomous in Moscow. It's not driven by Kremlin directives explicitly. It just services the Kremlin, but it decides what to do, how to do it, and what mistakes to recognize as mistakes and what mistakes to self-correct. So it kind of is like a bubble that floats parallel to the Kremlin, and it's a self-operating bubble that basically is allowed to go on without any intervention. I think in this case this has changed. So let's look at it. Krasovsky is a young man in his mid to late 40s. I have never met him. I'm aware of plenty of people who've spent time with him because he used to be in the opposition circles in Russia. So think of him as something like a climate change activist who's become a climate denier. That's an interesting trajectory. He's gay and he's HIV positive, which also means that he is an unwelcome figure in that propaganda machine. Especially now when there's real interest in pushing the homophobic agenda because there's a perception that it unifies people. So Anton Krasovsky is the boy's name. Krasovsky said that he went too far in that diatribe and just got carried away. Do I believe him? No, I don't. Because, of course, it is a metamorphosis that you go through when you go on stage as a propagandist. I mean, you're not going to sit around, no matter how delusional you are, you're not going to sit at home with your partner and children, now unable to go to the West, confined to Russia, and ventilate about the evil Anglo-Saxons that have taken over the world. Nobody seriously does that. So it's a role, it's a character role play. And you could get carried away conceivably to some extent, but no, that's not enough of an explanation. It wouldn't be an excuse anyway. I mean, you're just arguing the difference between one genocidal point and another. But it's not really an excuse here because you're talking about somebody with more than 2 decades worth of experience of high-level media, and you're talking about an appearance that wasn't live. It could have been live, but as far as I know, it wasn't, which means that they were probably okay with it at RT. And that what really happened is that there was a political decision to take Krasovsky out that wasn't made by Margot Simonyan, his boss. So it wasn't a TV decision. It wasn't a decision inside the propaganda machine. It was very unusually a political directive from outside that I think was partly a product of not wanting Krasovsky about anyway, and partly a product of the fact that that particular way of putting things threatens Putin's demographics sort of capacity to remain complacent about the war. Because you can say we'll start World War III, you can say we're going to do horrible things to everybody who, we don't like, and that might be focused on Ukrainians. But when you specifically begin talking about children, the 20% of the population that are strongly pro-war and pro-Putin are, for the most part, going to feel that's a bit off. I personally actually think that it's more evil to do systematic genocidal talk than it is to do visceral genocidal talk. So that kind of visceral genocidal talk that Krasovsky did is horrible, but as damaging as it is, it's less damaging than in a calm voice, giving an account of how some group is higher, some other group is lower, and the higher group has to take out the lower group. That is even more toxic. So I think that's my take on it. But the key takeaway is that there is this unusual incision of political intervention into the propaganda machine that's very atypical, and it might really be a bit of a reconfiguration of the entire propaganda field, because now they're going to feel that there is some way in which they need to buffer and boundary and balance what they say in accordance with political edicts coming from the top. That's new. It's a very, very interesting phenomena. If my guess about how this worked is right, which it looks like it is, then this is a level of direct political intervention into a propaganda machine that is not meant to be politically intervened with. It's meant to, as it were, self-administer its own corrections. What do you think of the comment that Russians are cowardly to not protest and shouldn't run away from their country? That's probably in response to the video yesterday. Well, it is in response to the video yesterday about Russian apathy. I think that it depends who says it, and it depends what else they say and what else they feel when they say that. So it's back to our conversation about always broadening your economy of ethical sentiment and not constraining it. So let's look. If you are Ukrainian and your townships are being destroyed, your people are being kicked out of their homes, kicked out of their country, your people are being injured, your people are being killed, your reality is turned upside down by this Russian invasion. Is a part of your emotional economy going to be, can we get these Russians moved to Mars, please? You mean the ones who are starting the war? No, all of them. So, yeah, that's a sentiment that has a place. Now, I think that you can go further with it reasonably if you're Ukrainian than if you're not. It will be sort of masturbatory and self-indulgent to go too far with that if you're not Ukrainian. But even if you are Ukrainian, that's got to be balanced with the opposite view. You know, the view that, no, that's not how you analyze anything. That's just activism, which is reasonable. That's what you've got to do when you're in a war. But it's not analysis. It's not analysis to say these Russians are running away, they're cowardly, they should stay and protest. Because there aren't just deep pathologies there. There's also terror in place that stops protesting. And it's very important to criticize a lack of protest by giving equivalent cases of where people protested. And so you can't criticize Russians for not protesting in 2022 by giving the example of Ukraine in 2014, because there's just no analogy there. In 2014, Ukrainians are protesting while the protest already has much of the political system on its side. It's a totally different situation. It's the difference between taking out the early seeds of authoritarianism versus taking on an established and unitary authoritarian system that'll just get rid of you without you necessarily accomplishing much. So that doesn't mean you can't tell Russians to protest, but it means that you have to come up with equivalent historical examples and take the conversation from there, or come up with hypothetical examples, imaginative situations, and do a kind of process of deliberation and tie that to the current Russian situation. So the answer is you've got to keep your economy broad, and it's not about being fair to Russians. It's about being fair to yourself as an individual who wants a realistic rather than an unrealistic picture of the world. And what Ukraine needs, of course, is to have a level of care and self-awareness that allows it to just not just win the war, but win the peace afterwards, which is to say, avoid becoming a heavily militarized country with toxic institutions which don't function properly, and a country that militarily threatens its neighbors. Yeah? That's what you don't want. What you want is a flourishing civic consciousness that stabilizes Ukrainian democracy so that it can act as a kind of regional but also, in fact, a global beacon of hope and optimism for the rest of the world. So, but that doesn't mean you're not going to feel angry things, and that's not going to be part of where you're at. How do you view Navalny's team? Alexei Navalny is the main opposition leader in Russia. He is a hero. I mentioned him briefly in yesterday's video on the main channel. This requires an hour-long conversation. Let me just say something brief on both sides of this debate. First, Navalny is not some kind of imperialist. His politics is anti-imperialistic, and no, the fact that he said questionable things about Crimea does not change that. The story with Navalny, which I'm not going to get into, is that he said the annexation was grossly unacceptable and illegal, but that there's no way to give Crimea back to Ukraine immediately. I'm not going to get into how that transpired, why he took that position. But he is real. He's not an agent of the Kremlin. He really was poisoned. All the conspiracy theories about him are nonsense. So broadly speaking, you should support Navalny's team, but you can support them very critically too. So do I have criticisms of them? Yes. Here is one of the, let's say, 5 criticisms I have of them. That the idea that you can ask of yourselves that you become the vanguard of all the Russian opposition movement may be a strategy that doesn't even make sense with Navalny free, let alone with Navalny in prison. The contrast to that is to operate as part of a network of oppositional groups that support each other and elevate each other. So there is a certain kind of unitariness of strategy there that isn't palpable. It's not stated by the Navalny team, but it's recognizable in their approach, and that might be a sort of strategic mistake. How do I stay receptive to alternative views without falling for them? Focus on values and commitments, not on sides and positions. And if you need to change ship because the heading is now unacceptable to you, you've got to be able to jump. Here is a YouTube tip. Know when to leave your preferred content creator if you see that they are losing their rudder and you see that they're not receptive any longer to recalibrating and regaining their rudder. Know when to leave. Most people who do the kind of thing that I am doing, which is not breaking down military strategy, not giving you news, but who actually give analysis, and in my case it's something even different to that, it's public intellectual analysis. Most people who do anything like me lose their rudder eventually, within a year, within 2 years. And you've got to know when to leave them. That story of why the majority who do what I do lose their rudder is a story we'll keep coming back to. One of the sort of benefits of my channels is that I will never lose my rudder. But I think what most people don't understand is how exceptional that is. You see, most people think that you keep your rudder as long as you have good intention and you are, operating in reasonably good faith, and you are, you're kind and you're not lying and so on. And that's not true. Most people with integrity lose their rudder. It's a very, very subversive process. And my tip is, know when it is happening to your favorite creators. We'll talk about some case studies of this. But one of the biggest things around the back when I have some infrequent interactions with other YouTubers, that I observe is just how consistent this trend is, that people are losing their rudder. Can you say more about the borderlessness that Russians feel, that you talked about in the video on the main channel? Short of saying too little or too much, let me just say something almost to the side of that question. Just like there is this feeling of borderlessness, that we don't know, many Russians feel, where our country ends and where it begins. It's a kind of an empire with a sense of, an aspirational sense of its borders. You know, its borders are always to be thought of as potentially increasing, and even if they're not increasing today, even if they're shrinking today, eventually in the long run, the zigzag of history will take our borders further out again. And so this idea of borderlessness has an adjacent thing that goes with it, and that's that you don't give up on the story of expanding your borders, even if it's transparent, you don't have the capacity to expand them. You know? So it's the syndrome of somebody with a missing leg who's trying to kick a football. And every time they fail to kick a football with their leg because it's missing, they become even more frenzied in their determination to try again. And that's why there will be people in Russia who at a stretch are saying, well, we've run out of rockets to get Ukrainians, let's get out, you know, hammers and batons and axes. We'll have to do it somehow. So there's this very strange commitment to pushing out your borders, even though you may have no capacity to really execute on that in practice. In your video, you emphasize the difference between Tsardom and the Soviet Union. Do you think this difference is underestimated? Yeah, it's massively underestimated. And all kinds of very toxic dynamics developed that we will talk about in detail in the Soviet period. I believe they were more lastingly and damagingly toxic than what we saw in Nazi Germany, actually. And what I would say is that there's a kind of interesting overlap between Putin's perspective, which is that the Soviet Union is the continuation of Tsardom. And that interestingly leads to this extraordinary thought that Putin almost thinks, actually, which is that the collapse of Tsardom wasn't in 1917, but in 1991. That's when Tsardom really collapsed in Putin's view, which is why he's so incendiary about the 1991 collapse. It's so historically unacceptable to him. There is a parallel, it's a superficial parallel, but it's still a parallel, between how Putin thinks about it and how victims of Russian imperialism think about it. Because if you're on the wrong end of Russian imperialism, you know, Ukraine, let's say, it don't matter that much to you on any given day, you know, who was doing it. And of course it matters, but you can also feel, God damn it, it's the same thing coming my way. It's Alexander III trying to have a go at my getting rid of my language and my culture. Then it's Stalin, then it's Putin. Same thing, here the Russians go again. And so it's important, however, to not miss these vast differences that we're going to talk about in the future. I know that asking what has Russia ever contributed to the world sounds stupid and racist, but I don't know exactly why. What would you say is exactly wrong with it? That's again clearly from the a few of the comments under yesterday's video on the main channel. The problem with that question isn't that you could give the wrong answer to it. The problem is that the question lacks not sense but sensibility. I would say a conversation about somebody who says, well, what has Russia ever contributed, is going to go through several stages, and we can only give a couple of them. The first is the importance of taking seriously the idea that it very rarely is a good thing to mobilize culture for political ends. So every time you are looking at a mobilization of culture for political purposes, be suspicious. Doesn't mean that it'll always be wrong what's said, but tendentiously be suspicious. If somebody goes, Tchaikovsky, Dostoevsky, war, and this is the connection, be suspicious. Second thing that this conversation will go through is what I would call sociological explanation rather than psychological and historical explanation. That's to say, sociological explanation that concerns itself with conditions that obtain and processes that develop that basically are neutral in respect to what the culturally particular features of a population are. So much of what's wrong in any given society, especially a society that is in a bad slum like Russia, is going to be explained sociologically. Never all of it. And culturally particular explanations are important. And in a certain sense, I myself rested on them primarily in yesterday's video. But that'll be another thread here. And then a third thread, but there are going to be many others, will be that you should be very skeptical to connect Russia's intellectual history with the current regime. In other words, it's a regime that sort of in a parasitic way uses some ideas from Russian history, but that relationship is parasitic. It's not really following any of them. So that's to say, it's a regime without ideas. It's a regime that deliberately avoids Russia's best conversations with itself, Russia's best expressions of collective self-understanding that have occurred over the last couple of centuries. And a good sort of comment that you can make about that first bit, the mobilization of matters of culture and matters of political discourse, is that it's rather Putinist to do so. It's a Putinist move to try to exploit culture for the benefit of political narratives, even if your narrative is, unlike Putin's, a politically just narrative. Lots of love and talk soon.